The war between humanity and the Xilari Empire had been brutal. The Xilari were an advanced alien race with technology far beyond anything humans had. But humans had something the Xilari didn't: determination, adaptability, and the will to fight even when outmatched. After years of conflict, against all odds, humanity won. The peace treaty was signed, but the Xilari king's pride had been shattered. To insult the victorious humans, he offered them what he considered his most worthless possession: his daughter, Princess Virexa. Virexa stood on the platform of the Xilari Royal Hall, her wrists bound in silver chains. She was beautiful in an otherworldly way. Tall and slender, with violet-hued skin and eyes that glowed faintly like stars. But her face was tight with fear and humiliation. She knew why she was being given away. She had been labeled useless because the royal medics had declared her infertile. In a culture obsessed with bloodlines and hairs, she had no value. When Captain Elias Grant, the human war hero, was summoned to accept the gift, everyone expected him to gloat. He had led the human forces in their most decisive victories, and his name was feared across the galaxy. But when Elias entered the hall, his reaction shocked everyone. He was nothing like the brutish conqueror that Xilari had imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered, and battle-hardened, he carried himself with quiet strength. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his sharp blue eyes swept over Virexa with curiosity, not cruelty. When the king presented his daughter, Elias's jaw tightened. "She's not a thing," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped forward and, without hesitation, unclasped the chains from Virexa's wrists. "You call this a gift? You insult both of us." Virexa's breath caught. She had expected mockery, maybe even violence. But instead, this human, this supposed savage, had freed her. She looked up at him, and for the first time, saw kindness in the eyes of an enemy. Their journey back to Earth began in uneasy silence. Virexa kept her distance, wary and confused. Elias treated her with respect, giving her space and speaking to her gently when needed. But something strange began happening. Cloaked Xilari ships started shadowing their vessel, barely detectable even with advanced human scanners. At first, it seemed like paranoia, until the first attack came. Their ship was ambushed in deep space. Explosions rocked the corridors as Elias led his soldiers into battle. Virexa watched from the control room, her heart pounding as humans fought with a ferocity she had never seen before. Elias was unstoppable, moving through the chaos like a force of nature. He fought with both skill and desperation, his only goal to protect his crew and her. When the last enemy fell, Elias returned, bloody but victorious. But the question remained: why were the Xilari attacking their own princess? As days passed, the tension only grew. Virexa started feeling weak, her body changing in ways she didn't understand. The ship's AI detected an assassination signal coming from inside their own vessel. Someone was still trying to kill her. The truth hit her like a thunderbolt. Her own people wanted her dead. But why now? What had changed? One night, as the ship drifted through the void, Elias found her on the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly before them, cold and distant. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly. "I won't let anyone hurt you." For the first time, Virexa believed him, and that scared her more than anything else. Their bond grew slowly but surely. Elias taught her about humanity, their history, their struggles, their triumphs. She saw the strength in their resilience and the kindness in their hearts. He treated her like an equal, never once using her as a trophy or a symbol of victory. And in turn, she began to trust him. But trust wasn't enough to keep them safe. A sabotage attempt nearly destroyed their ship mid-flight. In the aftermath, Elias fought like a man possessed, taking down armored assassins in brutal close-quarters combat. The battle was a blur of flashing steel and searing plasma, and when it was over, their betrayer was revealed. A Xilari servant planted among the crew. Before the servant died, he revealed the truth. The king had lied. Virexa wasn't infertile. The royal medics had falsified her diagnosis because any child she bore would threaten the king's power, if she ever had an heir, especially one with human blood. It could unite the two races in a way the king could never allow. The impossible happened shortly after they reached a human colony for refuge. Virexa collapsed, her body racked with pain. Human doctors made a shocking discovery. She was pregnant. The child she carried was the first hybrid of human and Xilari blood. A miracle and a threat. The news spread quickly. The king's fury knew no bounds. He declared the unborn child an abomination and mobilized his forces to wipe out any trace of this perceived disgrace. The colony became a battleground. Orbital bombardments rained fire from the skies as Xilari ships descended in waves. Human forces scrambled to defend their home, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Elias led the defense with fearless determination. Drones swarmed overhead, explosions painted the night sky, and the ground shook with the thunder of war. Virexa watched him fight, her heart in her throat. He wasn't just protecting his people, he was protecting their child. As the battle raged, they had no choice but to flee. Using advanced human cloaking technology, their ship slipped past the enemy blockade. But their escape came at a terrible cost. Many of Elias's closest friends died holding the line, their sacrifices heavy on his soul. The loss hardened his resolve. In their darkest hour, hope arrived from an unexpected place. A faction of Xilari rebels, tired of the king's tyranny, offered their aid. They believed in the unity that Elias and Virexa's child represented. Together, they prepared for one final stand. The final battle erupted on the surface of a desolate moon. Human and Xilari rebel forces fought side by side against the king's legions. Cloaked fighters darted through laser fire, AI war machines clashed with human ingenuity, and Elias led the charge. Virexa refused to remain a bystander. She fought alongside him, her determination burning brighter than ever. The battlefield became a nightmare of fire and blood, but they pushed forward, step by brutal step. In the end, it came down to Elias and the king. Their duel was fierce and unforgiving, both men driven by love and hate. When Elias finally stood victorious, the king's lifeless body at his feet, the war ended. Peace followed. The Xilari rebels declared Virexa their rightful queen, and humanity stood as honored allies. The child once called an abomination became a symbol of hope. Elias stood beside Virexa as more than a protector. He was her partner, her love, and the father of their future. As they looked out at the stars, their newborn child in her arms, they knew their fight wasn't over. But together, they would face whatever came next. The galaxy would never be the same. The days following the attack passed in uneasy calm, but the tension never truly faded. Virexa could feel it in the air, the quiet before the next storm. Every time the ship's lights flickered or the engines groaned, her heart leaped into her throat. She wasn't used to this fear. Back on Xilari Prime, she'd lived a life of isolation and quiet shame, but she had never felt hunted. Now, the danger was everywhere. Elias seemed unshaken, but she could see the wear behind his eyes. He was always moving, checking the ship's defenses, training his soldiers, working through long nights in the command room. She watched him from a distance at first, still unsure of her place. But the more she saw, the more her curiosity grew. One evening, she found him in the training bay. The room echoed with the clash of weapons and the sharp hiss of his breath. He moved with brutal efficiency, every strike calculated and deadly. Sweat gleamed on his skin, and his muscles coiled and released like a predator's. When he finally noticed her, he stopped, wiping his face with a towel. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. She hesitated, then nodded. "Neither could you." He gave a tired smile. "No rest for the weary." He gestured to the practiced swords on the rack. Want to give it a try? Varexa hesitated. She'd been trained in royal etiquette, not combat. But something in his eyes, something patient and steady, made her step forward. She picked up one of the blades, testing its weight. It felt awkward in her hands, but Elias just nodded. He taught her slowly, guiding her through stances and strikes. At first, she stumbled, but his patience never wavered. When their practice turned to sparring, he was careful but firm, pushing her just enough to keep her focused. By the end, she was breathless, but for the first time in weeks, the fear had eased. "You're a fast learner," Elias said as they put the weapons away. "I had a good teacher," she replied without thinking. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the space between them seemed very small. Then the ship's alarm blared. They raced to the command room. The cloaked auxiliary ships had returned, but this time, they weren't just observing. The first blast rocked the ship, and the battle began. Elias took command with calm precision, directing his crew even as the enemy fire grew heavier. Varexa stayed out of the way, but her heart pounded with every explosion. When the attackers finally retreated, the damage was severe. The engines were crippled, and their communications were down. Elias called for repairs, but the unease remained. The auxiliary shouldn't have been able to track them, not with the ship's advanced cloaking. That night, Varexa found herself in the medical bay. Her body had been feeling strange, dizzy spells, waves of exhaustion, but she hadn't wanted to seem weak. The human doctor scanned her, his brow furrowing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. "You're pregnant." The words didn't make sense at first. She stared at him, her mind spinning. "That's impossible," she whispered. The royal medics had told her she was barren. She had believed them. But the doctor's eyes held no doubt. When she found Elias, he was in his quarters, poring over star maps and damage reports. She stood in the doorway, her heart in her throat. "We need to talk," she said. He looked up, concern flickering across his face. "What's wrong?" She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I'm with child," she said softly. The words felt strange in her mouth. "Your child." For a long moment, there was only silence. Elias's face was unreadable, his blue eyes locked on hers. Then, slowly, he stood. "You're sure?" "The doctors confirmed it," she said. "But I don't understand how. My people told me I couldn't." "They lied." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge of fury beneath it. "They wanted to control you, and they're still trying to. That's why they're hunting us. They know." The truth settled heavily between them. The attacks, the sabotage, it all made sense now. The king would never allow a child that could unite their races. Their child. "We need to leave this ship," Elias said, his mind already working. "It's not safe here." But it was too late. The betrayal struck faster than either of them expected. The first explosion tore through the lower decks, and the ship lurched violently. Over the intercom, the security chief's voice rang out, cold and unyielding. "Captain Elias Grant, by order of the auxiliary king, surrender the princess and the abomination she carries." Elias's face darkened. "We've been betrayed." They ran. The corridors were chaos, fire and smoke, the sound of distant fighting. Elias's soldiers were loyal, but the enemy was already inside. As they neared the escape pods, a group of armored figures blocked their path. Elias didn't hesitate. He moved like lightning, his rifle spitting fire. Varexa fought beside him, her newfound training taking over. She wasn't as fast or as strong, but she was determined. And when the last enemy fell, she stood bloody but unbroken. The escape pod was their only chance. As they strapped in, the ship shuddered again. "Hold on," Elias said, and then they launched. The pod hurtled through space, and the view of their burning ship filled the window. Varex's heart ached for those they had left behind, but there was no time for grief. The child she carried was the future, and they had to protect it. When they finally landed on a remote human colony, the fight seemed far away, but the fear remained. Elias held her close that night, his warmth steadying her trembling body. "We'll keep you safe," he promised. "Both of you." But even as she drifted to sleep, she knew the war was far from over. The colony was nothing like the gleaming cities of Storie Prime or the vast human warships Virexa had seen. It was small and rugged, a collection of metal structures surrounded by endless stretches of red desert. The air was hot and dry, the wind carrying the scent of sand and machinery. It felt harsh and unforgiving, and yet it was the safest place they could find. Elias led her through the settlement, his hand firm on the small of her back, as if he was afraid she'd disappear. The people here looked at her with suspicion, their eyes lingering on her unusual violet skin and the delicate markings on her face. She was used to those stares, but here they felt sharper, more dangerous. "They'll warm up to you," Elias murmured as they walked. "They're just wary of outsiders." "Because of the war?" she asked. "Because of everything." His voice was heavy, and he didn't elaborate. They were given a small room in one of the outer buildings. It was simple: a bed, a table, a small screen for communications, but it was more than Virexa had expected. When she sat on the bed, exhaustion hit her like a wave. The baby, their baby, was draining her strength in ways she hadn't anticipated. Elias knelt in front of her, his hands warm against her knees. "Rest," he said softly. "I'll make sure we're safe." She wanted to argue, but her eyelids were already closing. The last thing she felt was the gentle brush of his fingers against her hair. When she woke, hours later, the room was dark. Elias sat at the table, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. Maps and data scrolled past, but he wasn't looking at them. His eyes were distant, his jaw tight. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up, and the weight in his gaze made her heart skip a beat. "The kings put a bounty on you," he said, "and on the child." The words hit like a physical blow. She knew her father's cruelty, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "How much?" she whispered. "Enough that every mercenary and bounty hunter in the sector will come looking." He stood, crossing the room in 2 steps. "We can't stay here." But before they could make a plan, the attack came. The first explosion shattered the quiet night, and the alarms followed. Elias grabbed his rifle, his face already hard with focus. "Stay here," he ordered. "No," she said, standing. "I'm not hiding." His eyes flashed with frustration, and something else, fear, but he didn't argue. Instead, he handed her a small sidearm. "Stay close." The colony was in chaos. Fires raged, and the air was thick with the sound of gunfire. Elias moved like a man possessed, cutting down attackers with brutal efficiency. Virexa followed, her hand steady even as her heart pounded. She wasn't a soldier, but she was fighting for her life, for their child's life. They made it to the hangar just as the second wave hit. A group of mercenaries poured in, and the battle turned desperate. Elias was fast, but they were outnumbered. When one of the attackers broke through his defense, Virexa didn't think. She just fired. The mercenary dropped, and Elias spun to look at her. "Nice shot," he said, a flash of pride in his voice. But there was no time for more. A ship was waiting on the far side of the hangar, their only chance. They ran for it, and Virexa could feel the baby stirring inside her, a strange warmth spreading through her body. The pain hit just as they reached the ramp. She stumbled, and Elias caught her. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. I don't know." The pain flared again, and she gasped. "We have to go," he said, his arm tightening around her. They made it inside the ship, and Elias sealed the hatch just as the enemy reached them. The engines roared to life, and they lifted off in a rush of fire and speed. But Virexa barely noticed. The pain was consuming her, and darkness pulled at the edges of her vision. When she woke, the ship was quiet. Elias sat beside her, his hand wrapped around hers. Relief flooded his face when she opened her eyes. "You're okay," he said softly. "The baby?" she asked, fear twisting in her gut. He smiled, a real, warm smile. "Strong, just like you." But their moment of peace was short-lived. The screen on the wall flickered to life, and the king's face appeared. Varex's breath caught. Her father's eyes were cold and furious. "You dare defy me," he hissed. "You dare carry this abomination." "This child is no abomination," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you'll never get your hands on them." The king's eyes narrowed. "You will bring my daughter back, or I will burn every colony you hide in." Varex's heart sank. She knew he would do it. He had before. "We'll stop him," Elias said after the screen went dark, but she could hear the doubt in his voice. They couldn't run forever. And the impossible had already happened. Now they had to fight. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound filling the small cabin. But Varex's heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands pressed against her stomach, feeling the faintest movement from the life growing inside her. Elias stood at the controls, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the display with the focus of a man who knew danger was only moments away. "We can't stay in this system," Elias said, his voice low and tense. "The king will have patrols sweeping every colony and trade route. We need to disappear." Varex's throat tightened. "But where can we go?" Elias turned toward her, and for a moment, his hard expression softened. "There's a human outpost on the edge of the Perseus Rift. It's remote, off the grid. We'll be safe there." Safe. She whispered the word like it was a distant dream. She hadn't felt safe in years, not since the war began, not since she'd been cast aside by her own people. And now, with the king's fury bearing down on them, safety felt impossible. But Elias made her want to believe in it. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against her cheek. "I promise you," he said softly, "I'll keep you both safe, no matter what." The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her, but before she could answer, the ship's console began to beep, a sharp, urgent sound that made Elias spin back to the controls. "Damn it," he muttered. "They found us." Varex's breath caught. Already. 2 ships on an intercept course. His fingers flew over the controls. "They're fast. We won't outrun them." Fear twisted inside her. What do we do? Elias's face was calm, but she could see the fire in his eyes. The same fire she'd seen when he fought to protect her on a colony. "We fight." The ship shuddered as the first blast hit. Lights flickered, and Varexa gripped the edge of the bed to keep from falling. Elias's hands were steady on the controls, his voice low and focused as he spoke to the computer. "Deploy countermeasures. Arm the forward cannons." The ship banked hard, and through the viewport, Varexa saw the enemy vessels, sleek, black ships with the king's crest glowing on their hulls. They fired again, and Elias rolled the ship just in time to avoid the blast. "Hold on," he warned. The ship surged forward, weapons blazing. Explosions lit the void, and one of the enemy ships spun out of control, trailing fire. But the second stayed on their tail, its guns spitting death. "We're taking too much damage." Varexa shouted as sparks rained from the ceiling. Elias didn't answer. His face was set in grim determination. The ship dove toward a nearby asteroid field, a chaotic mess of rock and ice. "What are you doing?" she asked, fear rising. "Buying us time," he said. "They won't follow us in there." The ship twisted and turned, dodging massive boulders with impossible speed. The enemy ship hesitated at the edge of the field, and for a moment, Varexa dared to hope they'd lost them. But then the pain hit. A sharp, searing agony spread through her abdomen, and she cried out, doubling over. "Varexa!" Elias was at her side in an instant, his arms around her. "What's wrong?" "The baby," she gasped. Something's wrong. Panic flashed in his eyes, but he forced it down. We're almost there, he said, his voice rough. Just hold on. But the enemy ship wasn't done. It fired one last shot. A lucky one. The blast tore through their engines, and the ship spiraled out of control. Elias fought the controls, but the asteroid field was unforgiving. They clipped a jagged rock, and the world turned upside down. When Virexa opened her eyes, everything was still. The cabin was dark, the air filled with the smell of burning wires. She pushed herself up, wincing at the pain in her side. "Elias?" she called, her voice shaking. "I'm here," he said, his voice rough. He was slumped against the controls, blood running down his temple. But he was alive. Relief washed over her. "The ship?" she asked. "Dead." He winced as he sat up. "But we're alive. That's what matters." They stumbled out of the wreckage into the harsh light of an alien sun. The asteroid they'd crashed on was barren and cold, the wind howling over jagged rocks. Elias carried a survival pack over one shoulder, his other arm wrapped tightly around Virex's waist as they moved away from the smoking ship. "We need to find shelter," he said, "before they come looking." Hours passed as they climbed over rocks and ridges. The pain in Virex's body grew worse, and the baby shifted restlessly inside her. But she didn't complain. She couldn't. Elias was hurting too, and yet he never let go of her, never stopped moving forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they found a cave, deep and sheltered from the wind. Elias built a small fire, and the warmth was a welcome relief against the freezing air. "We'll rest here," he said, his eyes scanning the darkness outside. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next move." But Virexa knew they didn't have that kind of time. The king's soldiers would come, and when they did, there would be no escape. "Elias," she started, but he silenced her with a gentle kiss. "I promised I'd keep you safe," he whispered against her lips. "I won't let them take you, or our child." Tears burned in her eyes. "You can't fight them alone." "I won't have to," he said, a small, fierce smile on his face. "Humans are stubborn, and we don't leave our own behind." As if on cue, the comm device crackled to life. "Elias, are you there?" a voice asked. Hope flared in his eyes. "We're here," he answered. "But we're in trouble." "Help's on the way," the voice promised. But as the wind outside shifted, carrying the distant sound of engines, Virexa knew their fight was far from over. The king wouldn't stop until he had her, and their child. And Elias wouldn't stop until they were free. The cold wind howled outside the cave, carrying the distant sound of approaching ships. Virex's heart pounded faster with every second that passed. She sat close to the fire, trying to ignore the stabbing pain in her abdomen. Elias stood near the cave entrance, his silhouette tense and watchful against the dim light of the alien sunset. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, his hand resting near the grip. "Ready." "They're coming," she whispered. Elias didn't look back. "I know." The sound grew louder. Engines cutting through the wind, the unmistakable hum of warships preparing for battle. Elias took a step forward, eyes scanning the horizon. Virexa wanted to tell him to stay, to hide with her, but she knew better. The man she loved wouldn't run. He'd fight, and she wouldn't stop him. "Elias, promise me you'll come back," she said softly. He turned then, his eyes finding hers. In them, she saw the same fierce determination she had sensed the day they'd met, the same fire that had kept them alive this long. He crossed the space between them, kneeling beside her. His hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I promise," he whispered. Then he kissed her, slow and deep, as if it might be the last time. And maybe it would be. Before she could say another word, the sound of landing ships thundered through the valley. Elias stood, rifle in hand, his body tense and ready. "Stay here," he said. "No matter what you hear, don't come out." "Elias." "Please," he said, his voice breaking just a little. "I need to know you're safe." She nodded, her throat tight, and watched as he disappeared into the shadows. The moments stretched into eternity. Varexa's hands pressed against her stomach, feeling the life inside her shift and stir. Fear twisted inside her. Fear for Elias, fear for their child, fear of the king's wrath. Then the first shots rang out. The sound was deafening. The sharp crack of gunfire, the distant echo of explosions. Varexa squeezed her eyes shut, each burst of noise making her heart jump. She wanted to stay put, wanted to listen to Elias's words, but when the screams started, she couldn't. She rose slowly, every movement sending a fresh wave of pain through her body. Grabbing the small dagger Elias had left with her, she moved toward the cave entrance. The wind was colder now, but she hardly noticed. The valley below was chaos. Fires burned where ships had crashed, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. Elias fought near the wreckage, a lone figure against the king's soldiers. He moved like lightning, his rifle spitting fire, his body a blur as he dodged and struck. Bodies fell around him, but more kept coming. And then she saw him. The king stood at the edge of the battlefield, tall and imposing, his golden armor glinting in the firelight. His face twisted in rage as he watched Elias cut down his soldiers. With a single gesture, more warriors poured from the ships, their weapons raised. Varexa's breath caught. Elias couldn't fight them all. He was fast, strong, but he was still only human. A sudden scream tore from her throat as she saw an enemy soldier take aim. Elias. He spun at the sound of her voice, just in time to dodge the blast. But it cost him. Another soldier struck from behind, and Elias went down. No, she cried, running toward him. The world blurred around her, pain forgotten, fear replaced by fury. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She drove the dagger into the nearest soldier's side, twisting it with a strength she didn't know she had. The enemy fell, but more turned toward her. Varexa. Elias's voice was hoarse, but he was alive, pushing himself up, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. The king's voice boomed over the battlefield. Seize them. They didn't stand a chance. Hands grabbed her, pulling her away from Elias. She fought, teeth bared, but there were too many. Elias was on his feet again, but he was surrounded, beaten back toward the burning wreckage of their ship. Bring them to me, the king commanded. They were dragged forward, forced to their knees before the king's towering form. His eyes burned with fury as he looked down at Varexa, and then his gaze shifted to her stomach. So it's true, he hissed. You dare carry this abomination. She carries our child. Elias spat. The king's eyes snapped to him. You, he sneered, a filthy human. You've tainted royal blood. For that, you'll die slowly. No, Varexa cried, but the king only smiled. Take him, he ordered. Elias struggled, but the soldiers held him fast. The king raised his weapon, a sleek, cruel blade, and Varexa's heart shattered. Stop, she screamed. Please, he's the father of your heir. The king hesitated, just for a second, and that second was all Elias needed. With a savage roar, Elias broke free. He moved faster than Varexa had ever seen, snatching a weapon from one of the soldiers and firing in one fluid motion. The king's guards fell, and suddenly the battlefield erupted again. Run, Elias shouted. But Varexa couldn't leave him. Not now. Not ever. The king charged, his blade flashing toward Elias. They fought, a brutal, desperate dance of steel and fire. Elias was fast, but the king was stronger. Each blow drove him back, each strike closer to ending everything. And then Varexa saw her chance. The king raised his blade for a killing strike, and she moved. The dagger was still in her hand. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She drove it deep into the king's side. He roared in pain, spinning toward her. But Elias was faster. The shot echoed through the valley, and the king fell. Silence followed. The remaining soldiers stared in shock as their leader crumpled to the ground. And then they ran. It was over. Elias was at her side in an instant, his arms wrapping around her as they sank to the ground. "You saved me," he whispered. "We saved each other," she answered, her voice breaking. The sound of engines roared above them. But this time, they weren't the enemies. Human ships descended from the sky, soldiers spilling out to secure the area. Help had come. But as Virexa felt the first sharp pain tear through her body, she knew their fight wasn't over yet. "The baby," she gasped. Elias's eyes went wide, but his arms held her steady. "We're going to be okay," he promised. And this time, she believed him. The battlefield was quiet now, the smoke settling, the fires dimming. The cold wind carried only silence where there had once been screams and the clash of weapons. The king lay dead, his golden armor darkened with blood, his once fearsome presence reduced to stillness. Around his fallen body, the remaining soldiers of his army had scattered, their loyalty crumbling without their leader. The war was over. But for Elias, the fight wasn't done. Not yet. He knelt beside Virexa, her face pale, her body trembling. Sweat glistened on her skin, and her breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. The pain she'd been holding back for so long had finally caught up to her. "Stay with me," Elias whispered, his voice rough with fear. His hand brushed her hair back from her face, his touch gentle despite the battle still echoing in his veins. "We're almost safe. Help is coming." She managed a weak smile. "You always keep your promises." Before he could answer, the sound of ships filled the air. But this time, it wasn't the enemy. Human ships descended from the sky, their sleek forms casting long shadows across the valley. Soldiers poured out, securing the area and tending to the wounded. A medical team rushed toward them, and Elias felt the weight on his chest ease just a little. But Virex's grip tightened on his hand. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "Never," he promised. Jake nodded, gripping the alien rifle that Lyra had given him. He had no idea how to use it effectively, but he trusted her. He had to. They didn't have time for second-guessing. As the explosions continued, the sounds of alien soldiers advancing grew closer. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, and every muscle in his body was on alert. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting for each other, for their future, for a chance to live beyond this war. Lyra activated the cloaking devices, and in an instant, they disappeared from sight. The world around them became a blur as they moved silently through the garage, taking their positions behind their makeshift defenses. Jake felt a cold sweat on his brow, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to let his fear take over. The garage was small, and they had no idea how many enemies they were facing. They had to be quick. They had to be clever. Through the faint hum of the cloaking devices, Jake could hear the faint rustling of alien soldiers outside. The invaders were close, too close for comfort. Jake's fingers tightened around the rifle as he steadied his breath. The first enemy soldier passed by without noticing them. Jake exhaled slowly, relieved, but he knew this was just the beginning. As the enemy forces closed in, Jake and Lyra took out their first target, one soldier at a time. Each shot was precise, silent, and deadly. They moved like shadows, striking quickly before retreating into the cover of darkness. But they couldn't take down the entire force this way. The soldiers were relentless, and the pressure was mounting. "Jake, move," Lyra shouted as another explosion rocked the ground beneath them. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the bombings were growing more intense. The alien forces weren't just attacking the city. They were targeting the garage. Suddenly, the garage doors burst open, and a group of alien soldiers stormed in. Jake barely had time to react as one of the soldiers aimed their weapon at him. In a split second, he fired back, narrowly missing the soldier's shoulder. The alien soldier returned fire, and Jake dove behind a nearby crate for cover. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. trying to steady his aim. Lyra was already moving, her alien weapon glowing brightly as she fired at the advancing soldiers. Each shot she took was calculated, deadly. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for revenge. For everything the aliens had done, for the destruction they had caused, for the lives they had taken. But the soldiers weren't backing down. The explosions outside, the blinding light of the bombardment, and the sound of blaster fire all merged into a chaotic symphony of war. Jake's ears were ringing, and he could feel his body growing fatigued. He had never fought like this before, but he wasn't going to stop. Not while Lyra was still fighting. The air was thick with smoke, and Jake's vision was blurred by the constant explosions. It felt like the world around him was collapsing. They were surrounded. There was no way out. Just when he thought all hope was lost, something unexpected happened. A loud crack echoed across the battlefield, and a figure appeared at the entrance of the garage. Jake couldn't believe his eyes. It was a soldier, but not an enemy. "Get down," the soldier shouted, raising his weapon. He was wearing the uniform of an alien military force, but there was something different about him. His movements were more fluid, more human. It was like he didn't belong in the ranks of the enemy. "Who are you?" Lyra shouted over the chaos, disbelief in her voice. "I was one of you," the soldier said, his voice rough. "I was a soldier in the war. I couldn't stand what we were doing anymore. I'm here to help." Without another word, the soldier opened fire on the remaining alien forces, catching them by surprise. The battle shifted in their favor. With the help of this unexpected ally, they managed to take out the remaining soldiers one by one. When the dust settled, Jake and Lyra were left standing, breathing heavily but alive. The soldier, though injured, gave them a small nod of approval. "We did it," Jake said, his voice hoarse. Lyra smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it together." The garage was silent now. The sounds of battle had faded, and in the distance, the first rays of sunlight began to break through the dark clouds. It was over. The alien forces had been defeated, and while there was no way to undo the destruction that had been wrought, Jake and Lyra knew they had fought for something bigger than themselves. Together, they had stood against impossible odds. Together, they had won. And in that victory, they had found something priceless: hope for the future. The sounds of battle were gone, replaced by the eerie silence of a world that had just witnessed the end of a war. The once bustling city, now scared by the violence of the alien invasion, lay in ruins behind them. The flickering lights from the distant fires cast long shadows across the landscape as Jake and Lyra walked away from the remnants of the war zone. There was nothing left for them here. The battle had been won, but the cost was high. Their story had already spread. The people of the city knew of their struggle, their fight against the alien forces, and the bond they shared. But while there was a sense of victory in the air, there was no peace to be found. The world had been changed forever, and the shadows of the past hung over them, threatening to tear apart the future they were trying to build. The decision was made quickly. They couldn't stay in the city, not with the eyes of the world upon them. Too many people had witnessed the violence, the chaos, and the final stand that had marked the end of the alien invasion. If they stayed, they'd be constantly reminded of the battle, constantly haunted by what had been lost. They needed to start over, somewhere far away from the war, from the pain. They needed a fresh start. Lyra had grown quiet as they walked, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. Her pregnancy had become a symbol of hope, not just for her and Jake, but for their entire species. She was carrying Jake's child, yes, but she was also carrying the future of both human and alien life. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the possibility of a world where their kind could coexist, where love could transcend the boundaries that had once divided them. Jake had never imagined this future. Before meeting Lyra, he had been just a soldier, doing his duty in a world that had long been at war. But now, everything had changed. He had seen the worst of what the aliens could do. He had fought, bled, and nearly died alongside Lyra. And now he was walking away from it all, walking toward a new beginning. "We can make it work," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was filled with quiet determination. "We'll find a place, somewhere deep in the wilderness. We can live there, away from everything." Jake glanced at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and fear. He knew what she meant. They needed peace. They needed a place where they could rebuild, not just their lives, but their love, their future. "I know we can," Jake replied, his voice steady, though a knot of worry tightened in his chest. The world they were walking into was uncertain. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had Lyra, and that was enough. They continued their journey, walking farther away from the city with each step. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the wilderness, away from the devastation. It was a place untouched by war, a place where the scars of the past had not yet reached. There, they would find a home. They would find a future. As they walked, Lyra rested her hand on Jake's arm, leaning into him for support. He could feel her warmth, her strength, and it gave him the courage to keep moving forward. There was a time when he had been afraid of the unknown, when he had doubted that they would ever find a way to survive. But now, with Lyra by his side, he felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. They finally reached a small clearing deep in the woods, the tall trees surrounding them like silent sentinels. It was a beautiful place, calm and serene. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves was the only noise, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. Jake and Lyra stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This was their new beginning, a place where they could heal, where they could build a life together, away from the darkness of the past. Lyra sat down on a large rock, her hand still resting on her belly. Jake knelt beside her, his eyes soft as he looked at her. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had made it. They had fought for each other, and now they had a chance to rebuild. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked, his voice filled with concern. Lyra smiled at him, her eyes bright with the promise of a future they would create together. "Stronger every day. The baby, it's growing. I can feel it." Jake reached out, placing his hand gently on hers. "And you? How are you feeling, really?" Lyra paused for a moment, her gaze drifting to the horizon. She could see the sun setting in the distance, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a breathtaking sight. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The war was over. The fight was behind them. They were safe. "I feel hopeful," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "We've been through so much, Jake. But now we have a chance for something better." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He couldn't imagine a life without Lyra, without their child. The future felt uncertain, yes, but he was no longer afraid. Together, they would face whatever came next. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. The days passed slowly as they settled into their new home. The wilderness was beautiful, peaceful, and it offered them a refuge from the chaos that had defined their lives for so long. They spent their days exploring the land, gathering food, and building their future one step at a time. Lyra's pregnancy continued, and with each passing day, she grew stronger. The bond between her and Jake deepened. They shared their dreams for the future, dreams of a life filled with love, with family, with peace. They talked about raising their child in a world free from the shadows of war, a world where their love could flourish without fear. As the weeks went by, Lyra's belly grew rounder, and Jake found himself becoming more and more protective of her. The thought of becoming a father was overwhelming, but it was also a source of excitement. He imagined the future, a future where their child would grow up in this beautiful place, far from the violence and destruction that had defined so much of their past. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jake and Lyra sat together on a large rock overlooking the forest. The sky was painted with shades of pink, purple, and gold. They watched in silence as the world around them seemed to come alive in the fading light. "Do you think our child will be like you?" Jake asked, his voice soft and full of wonder. Lyra smiled, her hand resting gently on her belly. "I think there'll be a little bit of both of us. A bridge between our worlds." Jake chuckled softly. "I hope they take after you. You've been through so much. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and affection. "We've both been through a lot, but we've made it. We've survived." And as the evening wore on, they sat together, hand in hand, gazing into the horizon. The future was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't afraid. They had each other, they had their love, and they had a child on the way. Human and alien, united by something stronger than the battles they had fought. It was a new beginning, one filled with hope, with promise, and with the belief that anything was possible as long as they faced it together.